I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 27 years old. My father looked me dead in the eye on my birthday morning and said the words that would change everything. "You're a leech, Sarah. You can't stay here anymore." He stood in our kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, my stepmom Linda smirking behind him like she'd just won the lottery. 27 years old and getting kicked out on my birthday. The audacity was almost impressive. I set my coffee mug down slowly, keeping my voice steady. "Excuse me?" But Dad wasn't backing down. "You heard me. It's time for you to grow up and stop depending on us." Linda actually nodded along like she was agreeing with some profound wisdom instead of witnessing a man destroy his daughter's birthday. I could have screamed, could have thrown that coffee mug right at the wall, but instead I did something that would haunt them both for months to come. I smiled. "All right," I said, standing up from the breakfast table. "I'll be out by tonight." The shock on their faces was almost worth the betrayal. They'd expected tears, begging, maybe a dramatic scene that would make them feel justified in their cruelty. What they got was calm acceptance, and that clearly wasn't part of their script. But here's the thing they didn't know. The little detail that was about to turn their perfect plan into their worst nightmare. I'd been paying more than just my share of rent for the past 3 years. Way more. And tonight, they were going to find out exactly what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up living with my father and his second wife in the first place. It's not exactly the life plan I had in mind when I graduated college 5 years ago. Growing up, Dad and I had always been close. My mom died when I was 15, and for years it was just the two of us figuring out life together. He taught me how to drive, helped me with college applications, and walked me through every major decision. I thought we were a team. Then Linda appeared 3 years after Mom's funeral, and suddenly everything changed. She wasn't evil, exactly. Linda was one of those women who smiled constantly, but somehow made you feel like you were always in the way. She had this talent for making suggestions that sounded helpful, but were actually criticisms. "Sarah, honey, maybe you should consider wearing something more professional to dinner." Translation? "You look like garbage. I just think it's wonderful how comfortable you are with your appearance." Translation: "You should probably hit the gym." Dad ate it up. After years of grief and single parenting, he was ready to hand over control to someone who seemed to have all the answers. Linda redecorated our house, reorganized our routines, and somehow convinced Dad that I needed more structure in my life. By the time I graduated college, they'd transformed from my loving family into this weird unit where I was clearly the third wheel. That's when the temporary living arrangement began. My entry-level marketing job paid enough to cover student loans and basic expenses, but not enough for a decent apartment in our expensive city. "Stay as long as you need," Dad had said. "Save some money, get on your feet." It seemed reasonable at the time. What I didn't realize was that Linda had already started calculating exactly how much she could extract from my gratitude. The first year was tolerable. I paid what seemed like fair rent, helped with groceries, and mostly stayed out of their way. But then Linda started making observations about my contributions to the household. Wouldn't it be fair if I covered the water bill since I took such long showers? Shouldn't I pay for the internet upgrade since I worked from home sometimes? Each request came with that same helpful smile and reasonable tone that made arguing feel petty. Before I knew it, I was covering more household expenses than both of them combined. But they framed it so cleverly that I felt guilty for even noticing. After all, they were letting me live in their house. They were doing me such a huge favor. The least I could do was show some appreciation, right? By year 3 of my temporary stay, I had somehow become the primary financial support for a household where I was treated like an unwelcome guest. Linda had perfected the art of making me feel simultaneously overprivileged and underappreciated. "It must be nice to have such a comfortable living situation," she'd say when I mentioned work stress. "Not everyone is lucky enough to have family willing to support them." Support me? I was paying the mortgage, utilities, internet, streaming services, and half the groceries. Dad's small pension and Linda's part-time retail job barely covered their car payments. But in their version of reality, they were the generous hosts and I was the spoiled child who refused to leave the nest. The worst part was how they'd gaslight me whenever I brought up the financial arrangements. "We never asked you to pay all that," Dad would say with genuine confusion, as if Linda hadn't specifically requested each contribution. "You offered because you wanted to help out." Linda would nod sympathetically, like she was sorry I felt taken advantage of but couldn't understand why. I started keeping records after a particularly infuriating conversation where they claimed I only paid a small portion of the household expenses. Receipts, bank statements, payment confirmations, I documented everything. The numbers were staggering. In 3 years, I'd contributed over $60,000 to maintaining a home where I was constantly reminded that I didn't belong. But the birthday confrontation wasn't really about money. It was about control. Linda had been pushing for this moment for months, dropping hints about how nice it would be to have the house to themselves, how healthy it would be for me to experience real independence. She'd painted my presence as a burden they'd nobly endured, and Dad had bought into the narrative completely. What they didn't expect was how calmly I'd take their ultimatum. They wanted drama, tears, desperate negotiations that would make them feel powerful. Instead, I just started making phone calls. Have you ever had someone completely underestimate what you're capable of? Share your experiences in the comments below. The first call I made was to the mortgage company. Hi, I need to cancel the automatic payment from my account for the property at... Linda was in the garden, probably planning how she'd redecorate my room. Dad was watching TV, likely already enjoying his vision of peaceful retirement without his demanding daughter around. They had no idea that their comfortable life was about to crumble. Next, I called the electric company, then the gas company, internet service, trash collection, water department one by one. I canceled every automatic payment that came from my accounts. 3 years of small contributions were about to disappear overnight, and they were going to learn exactly how small those contributions actually were. The most satisfying call was to our security system company. Linda was absolutely paranoid about break-ins and had insisted on the most expensive monitoring package available. For the family's safety, she'd said when she asked me to take over the payments. Well, the family was about to get a lot less safe. I spent the afternoon systematically dismantling the financial infrastructure that kept their lives running smoothly. Every time I hung up the phone, I felt a little more of my power returning. For 3 years, I'd been treated like a child who should be grateful for scraps. Tonight, they were going to see what happened when that child took her toys and went home. Dad found me packing around 4 in the afternoon. You don't have to leave today, he said, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly his bluff had been called. We just think it would be good for you to start making plans. Oh, I've made plans, I replied, folding my clothes with deliberate care. Everything's already arranged. The uncertainty in his voice told me he was starting to realize this wasn't going exactly as expected, but it was too late for second thoughts now. Linda appeared in my doorway around dinner time, no longer smirking. Sarah, we should talk about this like adults. Funny how I'd suddenly become an adult when my departure became inconveniently real. There's nothing to discuss, I said, loading another box into my car. You made your position clear this morning. By 7 p.m., my car was packed and I was ready to leave. I handed Dad my house key with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Thanks for everything, I said. I'm sure you'll be much happier without me around. I spent that night at my friend Jessica's apartment, sleeping on her couch and watching my phone buzz with increasingly frantic messages. It started around 11 p.m., just 3 hours after I'd left. Dad, Sarah, the internet isn't working. Did you pay the bill this month? Then around midnight, the security alarm is going crazy and we can't turn it off. Call me. By 1 a.m. This is ridiculous. I know you're getting these messages. Fix this right now. I turned my phone to silent and got the best night's sleep I'd had in months. The next morning brought a whole new level of panic. Linda was calling from Dad's phone, her voice barely controlled. Sarah, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this has gone far enough. The power company says our electricity will be shut off today unless someone pays the bill. I let it go to voicemail. Then I called my boss and asked for a personal day. This was going to be too entertaining to miss. By noon, both of them were calling from different numbers. Clearly, they'd borrowed phones from neighbors or friends. Sarah, please, we need to talk. Dad's voice sounded older somehow, less confident. I may have been hasty this morning. Can you come home so we can discuss this? Home. Interesting choice of words from someone who'd kicked me out 12 hours earlier. The messages kept coming throughout the day, each one more desperate than the last. Linda admitted she may have spoken out of turn about my contributions to the household. Dad suggested we could work out a new arrangement that might be more fair to everyone involved. But the call that really made my day came around 3 p.m. It was Dad, and he sounded absolutely broken. Sarah, they shut off the water. Linda is crying. Please, just tell me what you want and we'll figure this out. What I wanted was simple. I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd lost when they decided I was disposable. I wanted them to realize that their comfortable retirement was built entirely on the foundation of their ungrateful daughter's financial support. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be powerless, but I wasn't ready to give them answers yet. They'd spent 3 years teaching me patience. The second day brought pure chaos. Jessica's apartment became my command center as I watched my father and stepmother's perfect life fall apart in real time. Dad had called the mortgage company trying to explain that there had been some misunderstanding about the payment cancellation. The customer service representative politely informed him that only the account holder could make changes, and the account holder had been very clear about her instructions. Linda attempted to restore the internet service, only to discover that the account was in my name and required a $600 deposit to transfer ownership. Their savings account apparently couldn't cover it. She left me a voicemail that started professionally and devolved into barely contained hysteria. "Sarah, this is insane. You can't just destroy our lives because you're having a tantrum. Call me back immediately." A tantrum. 3 years of financial exploitation reduced to a tantrum. The most delicious moment came when Dad tried to call his bank about the mortgage situation. Through his panicked voicemail, I learned that they'd been living paycheck to paycheck, using my contributions to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. Without my small portion of the expenses, they were looking at foreclosure within 60 days. "Sarah, I'm begging you." His voice cracked during his 4th call of the day. "I made a mistake. We both did. Please come home and let's fix this together." But the real revelation came in a text message from Linda's phone around dinner time. "We know about the money your grandmother left you. We know you've been hiding it. If you don't fix the situation, we'll contest the will." And there it was. The truth finally came out. My grandmother had passed away 6 months ago, leaving me her entire estate after years of watching Dad spend money irresponsibly and disapproving of Linda completely. The inheritance was substantial enough to buy my own house, travel, or start a business. I'd kept it quiet while I figured out my next steps, but somehow they'd discovered it. Now everything made sense. The sudden urgency to get me out of the house, the brutal birthday confrontation, Linda's confidence during the whole scene. They thought they could push me out and then manipulate or guilt me into supporting them from a distance. With my inheritance as backup, they probably figured I'd cave to their demands within a few days. They thought wrong. I stood up from Jessica's couch, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. It was time for a face-to-face conversation, but not the kind they were expecting. They wanted to play hardball? Game on. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Of course it was, since they had no electricity. I could see candlelight flickering in the kitchen window and Linda's silhouette pacing frantically. Dad's car was in the garage, so I knew they were both home, probably rehearsing their apology speech and planning their next manipulation. I knocked on the front door and waited. This was going to be fun. Dad opened the door holding a flashlight, his face drawn and exhausted. Behind him, Linda clutched a candle like some Victorian ghost. Her usually perfect hair disheveled and her makeup smudged. They looked like refugees from their own lives, which honestly was exactly what they were. "Sarah, thank God," Dad breathed, stepping aside to let me in. "We need to talk." The house felt different without electricity. Colder, smaller, more desperate. They'd set up camp in the kitchen with candles and battery-powered radio, like they were weathering some natural disaster instead of dealing with the consequences of their own actions. "Before you say anything," Linda jumped in, her voice tight with forced composure, "we want you to know that we've discussed this situation and we realize we may have been hasty in our approach." Hasty. Like kicking your daughter out on her birthday was just poor timing. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where Dad had delivered his ultimatum 24 hours earlier. "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice neutral. They exchanged glances, clearly having rehearsed this conversation. "We've been under a lot of stress lately," Dad began, "and maybe we didn't communicate our concerns about your living situation as well as we should have." The candlelight flickered across his face, making him look older, more fragile. "But this reaction of yours, canceling all the utilities and services, it's extreme." "Is it?" I leaned back in my chair, genuinely curious. "You called me a leech and threw me out. I simply stopped paying for services I won't be using. How is that extreme?" Linda's mask slipped slightly. "You're deliberately trying to hurt us," she accused. "This isn't about independence or standing up for yourself. This is revenge." Finally, some honesty. "You're right," I said, and watched their eyes widen in surprise. "It is revenge. You spent 3 years taking advantage of my gratitude and then had the audacity to make me feel guilty for existing in my own father's house. So yes, Linda, I want you both to understand exactly what you've lost." Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sarah, we know about your grandmother's inheritance. There it was. Their real play. We know you're not struggling financially anymore. You could easily afford your own place. I could, I agreed. I've been able to afford my own place for 2 years now, but I stayed because I thought family mattered. I thought I was helping people I loved. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below. We know we made mistakes, Dad continued, his voice growing more desperate as he realized his trump card hadn't worked. But we're family, Sarah. We can work through this. Linda nodded earnestly, like she hadn't spent years treating me like an unwelcome burden. Family, I repeated slowly. Is that what you call making your daughter pay for everything while treating her like she's a failure? I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. Would you like to know exactly how much this family member has contributed to your comfortable lifestyle? They watched nervously as I scrolled through 3 years of payments. Mortgage payments, $18,000. Utilities, $12,000. Internet, security, insurance, groceries. Dad, I've given you over $60,000 while you lectured me about responsibility, and Linda dropped hints about how nice it would be to have the house to yourselves. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the radio crackling in the background. Linda was the first to speak, and her voice had lost all pretense of sweetness. We never asked you to pay all that. You're right. You never asked. You manipulated, suggested, and guilt-tripped. Much more sophisticated than asking. I stood up, tired of the performance. But here's what I find most interesting about this whole situation. I walked to the window and looked out at their dark neighborhood. You kicked me out because you thought I was dependent on you. But sitting here in the dark, begging me to come back, who exactly is dependent on whom? Dad's flashlight beam wavered slightly. What do you want, Sarah? What will it take to fix this? Fix this? I turned back to face them. Dad, you can't fix 27 years of feeling like I was never quite good enough. You can't fix the way Linda made me feel like an intruder in my own home. And you definitely can't fix the fact that you chose your wife's comfort over your daughter's dignity. That's not fair, Linda protested. I never made you feel unwelcome, didn't you? I pulled out my phone again. I've been keeping notes, Linda. 3 years of comments, suggestions, and observations. Would you like me to read them back to you? The fear in her eyes told me she remembered exactly what she'd said and done. She knew there was no innocent explanation for years of systematic emotional manipulation. We'll make it right, Dad said desperately. Tell us what you need. What I need, I said, heading toward the door, is for you both to understand that actions have consequences. You treated me like I was disposable, so I disposed of myself. Enjoy figuring out how to afford your lifestyle without your Leech daughter. I left them sitting in their dark kitchen and drove straight to the lawyer who'd handled my grandmother's estate. Gerald Morrison had been Gran's attorney for 20 years, and he'd taken a special interest in making sure her final wishes were carried out exactly as she'd intended. Sarah, he greeted me warmly when I arrived at his office the next morning. How are you adjusting to your new financial situation? Gerald was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my inheritance, not just the money, but the family history that came with it. Actually, that's why I'm here, I said, settling into the chair across from his massive mahogany desk. My father and stepmother seem to think they have some claim on Gran's estate. They mentioned contesting the will. Gerald's expression hardened. Did they now? He pulled out a thick file and set it on his desk. Your grandmother was very specific about her reasons for leaving everything to you. She documented years of financial irresponsibility from your father and made it clear that Linda was never to receive a penny. She knew about Linda's behavior? This was news to me. Oh, she knew everything. Gerald opened the file and pulled out several handwritten letters. Your grandmother was a shrewd woman, Sarah. She'd been watching your living situation for years, and she was furious about how they treated you. He handed me one of the letters, written in Gran's distinctive handwriting. My dear Gerald, it began. I'm watching my granddaughter sacrifice her independence to support a father who takes her for granted, and a stepmother who actively undermines her self-worth. David has always been weak when it comes to money and women, but I never thought he'd allow someone to abuse his own child. I felt tears starting to form as I read Gran's words. She'd seen everything, understood everything, and she'd been powerless to stop it while she was alive. But death had given her the ultimate weapon, the power to rewrite the family dynamic completely. There's more, Gerald said gently. Your grandmother hired a private investigator to document your financial contributions to the household. She has 3 years of evidence showing exactly how much you were paying and how they were treating you in return. She was building a case. She was protecting you. Your grandmother knew that her death would trigger a family crisis, and she wanted to make sure you had every advantage. Gerald pulled out another document. This is a letter she wrote to your father, to be delivered only if he attempted to contest the will or manipulate you regarding the inheritance. My hands shook as I read Dad's letter. Gran's words were surgical in their precision, detailing every financial mistake he'd made, every time he'd chosen Linda over his daughter, every moment he'd failed to protect me from his wife's emotional abuse. The final paragraph was devastating. If you are reading this letter, it means you've decided to prioritize money over your relationship with Sarah. This confirms every fear I had about the man you've become. Gerald, I said slowly, I need you to deliver this letter to my father. Today. I followed Gerald's car to my father's house, wanting to see Dad's reaction firsthand when he realized exactly how much my grandmother had known about his failures as a parent. The electricity was still off, but Linda had apparently borrowed a generator from somewhere because I could hear it humming in the backyard. Gerald knocked on the front door with the formal authority of a man who'd spent decades delivering life-changing news. Dad answered wearing the same clothes from the night before, looking like he hadn't slept. His face fell when he saw the lawyer standing on his doorstep. Mr. Mitchell, Gerald said formally, I have a letter from your late mother to be delivered under specific circumstances that have now occurred. He handed Dad the envelope bearing Gran's handwriting. What circumstances? Dad asked, but his voice already carried the weight of someone who suspected the answer. Your daughter informed me that you've threatened to contest your mother's will, Gerald replied. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell anticipated this possibility and left instructions accordingly. Linda appeared behind Dad, her face immediately suspicious. What's this about? Perhaps you should read the letter first, Gerald suggested. I'll wait. I stayed in my car, but I could see Dad's face through the front window as he read Gran's final words to him. The progression was fascinating to watch, confusion giving way to shock, then to what looked like genuine grief. His shoulders sagged as he reached the final paragraph, and for a moment, I actually felt sorry for him. Linda grabbed the letter from his hands, her expression growing more furious with each line. When she finished reading, she turned to Gerald with barely controlled rage. This is harassment from beyond the grave, she spat. Eleanor was a bitter old woman who never liked me. Mrs. Mitchell was a careful woman who documented everything, Gerald replied calmly, including your systematic financial exploitation of her granddaughter and your emotional manipulation tactics. She has 3 years of evidence, Mrs. Mitchell. 3 years. Dad looked up from the letter, his eyes finding my car in the driveway. For the first time in years, I saw something in his expression that looked like the father I remembered from before Linda. Shame, regret, and the dawning realization of what he'd lost. But Linda wasn't finished. We'll fight this, she declared. We'll prove that Sarah manipulated a sick old woman. Gerald smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. Mrs. Mitchell, I feel obligated to inform you that contesting this would require you to prove financial hardship and dependency on the deceased. Given that you've been living comfortably on Sarah's income for 3 years while claiming she was a burden, that argument might be challenging to make in court. The color drained from Linda's face as the implications hit her. Any legal challenge would expose their true financial situation, revealing that they'd been lying about who was supporting whom. Their fraud would become public record. Furthermore, Gerald continued, Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell's estate includes detailed financial records showing exactly how much Sarah contributed to this household. If you proceed with litigation, those records will become evidence. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? It was checkmate, and everyone knew it. Dad walked out to my car while Linda retreated into the house, probably to plan her next manipulation strategy. He looked older than his 54 years, defeated in a way I'd never seen before. When he knocked on my window, I rolled it down but didn't turn off the engine. She knew, he said simply. Your grandmother knew everything. His voice was hollow, like he was talking to himself more than to me. She watched me fail you over and over again, and she knew. She loved you, Dad. That's why this hurt her so much. I kept my voice gentle, despite everything. She wanted you to be better. I read her letter twice, he continued, leaning against my car. She was right about everything. About Linda. About the money. About how I let you down. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Sarah, I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it, I said, and watched him flinch. Dad, you chose Linda over me every single day for 3 years. You let her treat me like an intruder in my own home. You took my money while lecturing me about responsibility. You kicked me out on my birthday and called me a leech. I know, he whispered. I know all of that. Do you? Because 5 minutes ago, Linda was in there planning to fight Gran's will. She's not sorry, Dad. She's angry that her meal ticket got taken away. I put the car in drive. The difference between you and her is that you're capable of shame. But being ashamed doesn't undo 3 years of damage. He stepped back from the car. What happens now? Now you figure out how to live without my money, I said. You learn what it actually costs to maintain your lifestyle. And maybe, if you're lucky, you figure out who you were before Linda convinced you that your daughter was your enemy. I started to drive away, then stopped and rolled down the window again. Dad, Gran left me a letter too. She said the hardest part of dying wasn't leaving this world. It was leaving me alone with you and Linda. She was afraid you'd broken me permanently. Have I? He asked. And for the first time in years, he sounded like my father instead of Linda's husband. No, I said, and meant it. You taught me I'm stronger than I thought, just not in the way you intended. As I drove away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, standing in the driveway of his dark house, holding my grandmother's letter like it was evidence of his own failure as a father, which I suppose it was. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new house, making coffee in the bright morning sunlight that streamed through windows I'd chosen myself. The house was modest but perfect. 3 bedrooms, a garden, and most importantly, a mortgage that was entirely mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Coffee later? I want to hear about the promotion. The promotion had come through 2 weeks ago. Marketing director at a growing tech company, with a salary that made my old contributions to Dad's household look like pocket change. My relationship with Dad had evolved into something cautious but real. After Linda filed for divorce 4 months ago, taking half of their remaining assets and leaving him to face foreclosure alone, he'd started calling me. Not for money, I'd made it clear that ship had sailed, but to talk. Really talk, for the first time in years. I understand now, he'd said during our last conversation. I understand what your grandmother saw, what you went through. I just don't know how to live with it. You live with it by being better, I'd told him. You can't undo the past, but you can stop repeating it. He was living in a small apartment now, working part-time at a hardware store, learning what it meant to live within his actual means. Linda had moved in with some new boyfriend within a month of their separation, apparently having found another man willing to support her lifestyle. Some patterns never change. Kevin, my old college friend who'd helped me research lawyers, stopped by that afternoon with a housewarming gift. A framed photo of my grandmother and me from my college graduation. She'd be proud, he said, looking around my sunny living room. I think she'd be relieved, I replied. She spent so many years watching me give pieces of myself away to people who didn't value them. And now I know what I'm worth. I set the photo on my mantelpiece, right next to the last letter Gran had written to me, the one Gerald had delivered after the will reading. In it, she'd written, My dear Sarah, by the time you read this, you'll have learned that love without respect is just manipulation with better marketing. You deserve both. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint my garden in shades of gold and orange. My phone rang. Dad's number appeared on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Hi, Dad. Sarah, I just wanted to say, I know I can't fix what I did, but I want you to know that I see it now. I see who you really are, and I'm sorry it took losing you for me to figure it out. I know, I said. And I did. His apologies had become genuine over the months, backed by actions instead of just words. Dad? Yeah? I'm not lost anymore. You didn't lose me permanently. You just lost the version of me that was willing to be treated badly. I paused, choosing my words carefully. If you want to know the person I actually am, instead of the person you thought you could control, I'm here. The conversation that followed was different from any we'd had in years. Honest, respectful, free from Linda's influence and my own desperate need for approval. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to my father instead of my landlord. After we hung up, I pulled out my laptop and opened the blog I'd started 3 months ago. Worth it. Stories of finding your value. The response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from people who'd recognized their own stories in mine, who'd found the courage to stop accepting less than they deserved. Tonight's post was about forgiveness. Not the kind that erases consequences, but the kind that frees you from carrying other people's failures as your own burden. I wrote about my grandmother's wisdom, about learning the difference between love and manipulation, about the power of knowing your own worth. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about finding your strength when the people you trust most try to convince you that you don't have any. Your support means everything, and remember, you're worth so much more than the people who take you for granted want you to believe. The last line I wrote that night was for my grandmother, wherever she was. Thank you for teaching me that the most radical act of self-love is refusing to accept treatment that contradicts your worth. And for the first time in years, I felt truly, completely free.